Leyline of the Guilt-backed scam was not on my radar of decks people would break.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting one. Here we see a pretty good opening hand from Eduardo. He does have Grief with Not Dead After All. Also has a Leyline of the Guild Pack to maybe make a Scion of Draco more effective later on. Meanwhile, we see a pretty bread and butter opening hand for a Prowess style deck from Carmen with a couple of Prowess creatures, couple of burn spells, and then maybe that Underworld Breach that can get something going later. And here on Eduardo's side on the play, we're going to see that Evoke Grief, Not Dead After All interaction that we've seen a number of times over the last couple of years in the modern format.
Yeah, something I want to bring attention to here is Leyline of the Guilt-backed notably quite powerful here even without Scion of Draco, because the Prowess deck is ultimately an extremely aggressive deck, and when you're Grief scamming on turn 1, Leyline of the Guilt-backed giving you a Grief lifelink is really tough for the Prowess deck. So if Carmen can't find one of her redundant pieces of removal, this Leyline could be a really big game.
Yep. And here I think we're seeing Eduardo decide he's going to take the Prowess creatures instead of the spells, especially given that stuff like Lava Dart has Flashback and Underworld Breach lets you cast some of those spells out of the graveyard. I certainly think that this is a really strong start for Eduardo, especially that Leyline of the Guild Pact allowing a Ragavan to come down next turn, if nothing else. That right, Overgrown Tomb, not normally able to cast a red spell, but Leyline of the Guild Pact makes it all basic land types, and so I think we're going to see Eduardo deploy the Ragavan, although not particularly great into the card Lava Dart.
Yeah, and here's some of the issues with clunkiness I talked about earlier with the deck, where sure you have these really powerful combos, but if you draw another Leyline of the Guild Pact, like yeah, there's a bunch of just basically dead draws in your deck past this point. More Leylines, more Not Dead After Alls. So that can make the mid game pretty tough if you don't get out of the gates quickly.
That's a Leyline binding, the new art from the Outlaws of Thunder Junction bonus sheet. Pretty good pickup for Eduardo, given that his Overgrown Tomb meets the entire domain requirement. It's one of the really interesting things that you see happen in these bigger formats, where something like Leyline of the Guild Pack that wouldn't necessarily make quite as many waves in standard, really turning on synergies from across lots of different years of lots of different sets, right? Scion of Draco from Modern Horizons, Leyline Binding from Dom and Arya United, these different cards from different time frames in Magic all coming together in these older formats that have much wider card pools for some really weird looking results.
Yeah, that's one of the nicer things about these older formats is you get these emergent play patterns that we're unwilling to prescribe in standard because they're not that fun if they come up a lot in a format that's open to like newer players. But when you get to older formats like Modern, we can encourage interactions like this where mostly more enfranchised players are playing Modern. You can trust that the people playing Modern are really invested and can take advantage of and play with these cool play patterns that are a result of that.
Here we haven't really seen Eduardo do much else other than just put this Grief out, but so far that's getting the job done. I mean, Carmen's down to 5. Lots of good stuff going on Carmen's side, but that, I mean, right, fetching here down to 4, she needs to figure out how to answer this Grief in some manner.
Yeah, and I want to draw attention to the fact that Carmen missed a land off Expressive Iteration last turn. So we saw her draw Lightning Bolt that was actually going to put her in a really good position where even despite the Grief having come down early, if she was able to get rid of it last turn. But missing a land off that iteration was brutal because it gave Eduardo a window to draw another Not Dead After All, which I think is probably going to win the game for him here.
Yeah, and we're seeing Carmen fire off multiple Lava Darts to get those extra Prowess triggers, those extra Surveil triggers, trying to set up not a big turn, but maximize her damage here outside of maximize her damage here while also answering the Grief. But this Not Dead After All gonna sort of put that idea to bed, unfortunately for Carmen.
Yeah, and you'll notice that that Eduardo played Not Dead After All in response to his second Lava Dart rather than the third. That's because if he'd waited on it until the third one was was on the stack, Carmen could have then flashed back the other lava dot in response to Not Dead After All.
Yep. Really clean play from Eduardo on that, and we're gonna see Eduardo go up one game to nothing here on the back of that really powerful grief, not that after all start that I know a lot of people really don't like. I know there are a few fans out there. I'm not gonna necessarily stake my claim one way or the other, but
It could go either way for you, really. Who's to say?
yeah, exactly. What do you think we're going to see from each of these players in sideboarding?
I think we're gonna see Carmen try and bring in some things to exploit that clunkiness out of Eduardo's deck. So we're seeing Pick Your Poison, Flame of Anor, things that answer Eduardo's really powerful, things that answer Eduardo's really powerful, uh, really powerful threats, while also while like leaving halves of combos stranded. So if you look at something like Pick Your Poison, not the strongest in and of its own right, but makes the Leyline of the Guild Pack Scion of Draco type stuff look really clunky because you can pick off one piece and then the other piece is kind of below rate as an individual combo piece. Meanwhile, Eduardo just wants more interaction, wants to not die, wants to maybe take out some of the clunkier cards. We're seeing not the full four fables. We're seeing Ragavan cut because of Lavada, things like that. Just like trying to stay low to the ground as possible.
So I think something interesting here is we're seeing Carmen not necessarily go towards something like Blood Moon, even though traditionally Blood Moon is really strong into decks with Leyline Binding, Territorial Combo, these decks that rely on lots of non-basic lands to give them all their basic land types. What do you think the logic, what do you think is going through Carmen's head right now, deciding to what looks to be leave that Blood Moon in the sideboard?
Yeah, so Blood Moon is an interesting card because I mean, when it comes down, it will shut down pretty much all of Eduardo's deck. But the thing is, in this matchup, Blood Moon coming down on turn 3, there's no acceleration, and for Eduardo, uh, all he needs to do is turn 1 and 2 plays off those colored manas. The Leyline comes down on turn 1, turn 0, and then Scion comes down on turn 2. Grief comes down on turn 0, and then Not Dead After All comes down on turn 1, and then Not Dead After All also comes down on turn 1. So those turn 1 and 2 plays are the only points we really need that extra colored mana. And then if after that Eduardo fetches a single swamp at some point, he can just cast all his spells. It's only those early plays that need the colored mana. So despite Blood Moon looking good against these 5 colors of lands, it's not actually great.
I think that makes a lot of sense, especially given that we saw what we saw in game one with all Eduardo really needed to do was put that grief into play on the first turn, and that was mostly good enough. What do you think of
Yeah.
the keep here specifically from Eduardo? I think that right, this hand has half of each of those combos that you mentioned, right? We have the Leyline but no Scion, we have the Not Dead but no grief. What do you think about keeping hands that are halfway there as opposed to maybe looking to mulligan a little bit more aggressively to get both pieces of one of those combos?
So this red black deck is pretty resource heavy, more so even here than like traditional red black scam because Leyline is coming down turn 0. That's an extra card you lose, and given how resource heavy it is, mulliganing is pretty tough against a deck like Prowess, which has a pile of removal. And on so keeping a hand that has a bunch of spells and gives you outs to draw towards your 2 most powerful combos makes a lot of sense to me, particularly given that Not Dead After All combo less good on the draw when there's some potential for your opponent to leave up removal. So it makes sense to prioritize Leyline in your opening hand, since that's a combo piece you can't draw into and have to have in your opener.
Sure, I think that makes a lot of sense. Meanwhile, from Carmen's standpoint, looks like a pretty good, reasonable start. Cantrip on one, couple of Prowess creature on one, Prowess creature cantrip on two. Just a pretty standard looking start from Prowess as we see Eduardo go with a Tribal Flames to remove one of those creatures, try and slow down Carmen's clock, like you mentioned in sideboarding, to play maybe a little bit more of a mid-rangey or fair game that these sorts of evoke type decks are capable of, but maybe would prefer to be on the front foot, I guess.
Yeah, I want to draw attention actually to the planes that Eduardo fetched there because there's a Leyline in play. There's technically no need to fetch anything, but Eduardo respecting the Blood Moon in Carmen's sideboard because he didn't know she brought it in, and Plains is the one land that gives him access to Leyline Binding, the only thing that can remove Blood Moon in his deck.
Very heads up play from Eduardo as we see the new addition to Prowess, and one of the things that I think we've seen lead people to be more interested in registering this style of deck, Slick Shot Show Off, a really strong addition from Outlaws of Thunder Junction to red decks in basically every format, right? We saw some Slick Shot red decks at the Pro Tour in Standard. We've seen it popping up in Pioneer and now making its way back to Modern. Also, what Eduardo played last week in his quarterfinal match to get here to the top 4.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a strength of this deck, right? If your draw is clunky, this deck just murders you extremely quickly. And this is a good example of that, where really, like, Eduardo kept a hand, hoping for a high roll, missed on the first 2 turns, and the game's just already over.
This lightning bolt coming off of expressive iteration is going to make for a bunch of prowess triggers, a bunch of slick shot triggers, which are like double prowess triggers, and going to make life pretty tough on Eduardo here.
And with the lightning bolt exile, this is a clean 7 points, not even considering the additional lightning bolt that's available next turn. So I have to imagine this game's over.
Yeah, it looks like there's not really much that Eduardo can do from this point, or at least not that I'm seeing. We're seeing him point 1 damage at the slick shot show off. Maybe the plan here is point the damage at slick shot show off, hope that you somehow survive combat, and then not dead after all. But no, looks like he's walking with an orc instead. And I think this lightning bolt's gonna do it. Is that right? That's the second trigger on the slick shot, making that
8 damage.
A lot of damage in the air and not a lot of life left for Eduardo, as we see Carmen tie things up and send us to a third and deciding game to see who will be facing off against you in the finals of MTGO Masters Season 1.
Yeah, and we can see Eduardo actually like live adjusting to what we saw out of Carmen that game, recognizing that despite there being things like Blood Moons in the sideboard, what this matchup is actually about is being low to the ground. And so it makes a lot of sense for him to be cutting a Fable, trying to go a little lower after seeing how that game played out. Also, Raghavan, a bit of a liability on the draw against all those lava dots. A little better on the play, because if your Raghavan's getting lava dotted on the play on 1, then it means your opponent is not playing out a prowess creature on 1 and is applying less pressure.
I think that's a really good idea. Any adjustments you might look to make from Carmen's side based on player draw considerations?
We saw Carmen pull out, in addition to the Blood Moon, the surgical extractions to the side. And there's like some world in which I could see her trying to bring one of those in, just because one or two of those in, just because it's a response to the not dead after all combo on turn 0. But broadly, that's too situational. You need to have like 2 answers for that to matter. So there's not really very much I'd want to adjust other than simple numbers changes.
Here, looking at opening hands for both players, we see Grief and Not Dead After All for Eduardo, but no other black card for him to pitch. And yep, we're going to see a mulligan and find Grief, Not Dead After All, and a Thoughtseize to pitch. That seems like about the best start that you can ask for from Eduardo's deck. What are you seeing from Carmen's opening hand that you like or dislike?
Well, what I really like for Carmen in this spot is the fact that she has 2 answers. She has 2 answers that are going to be like forced to be taken with Grief, and then a threat on top of that. So all she's really looking to do here is top deck her way to another answer. Notably, Unholy Heat, also an answer in this spot. Not only because Carmen can try and find Delirium, but because Pick Your Poison can technically make Eduardo sacrifice the roll on Grief and get it back down to 2 toughness if you absolutely need to.
A very niche interaction that yeah, certainly can come up. Any sort of when the Grief style decks are so all in on Grief as their threat, much like Eduardo's hand here is, any way that you can get that creature off the table is something to take note of.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that this grief combo is ultimately very card intensive. Eduardo's spent 3 cards here to trade with 2 cards from Carmen and get a threat. But with that and being on the play, Eduardo's down a lot of cards. So if Carmen answers this, she's in pretty good shape. And she has quite a few looks, I'd say, before things start to get risky.
Here we see the slick shot show off is the draw for Carmen. If you're in Eduardo seat, at least from my vantage point, I'm looking to draw something like a territorial Kavu, just some sort of follow up threat that you can slam on the second turn of the game to cut the amount of time that Carmen has to draw out of getting scammed, so to speak. Meanwhile, like you said, from Carmen's standpoint, any answer to grief is going to put her certainly in the driver's seat.
Yeah, it's a little awkward that what would normally be Eduardo's best draw here is locked off by that pick your poison. Under normal circumstances, trying to draw to a Scion of Draco with a black creature that gains lifelink in play would be really nice. And it's just a bigger flying threat that I think Garmin has. But with Pick Your Poison, I think that puts Territorial Kavu, Orcish Bowmaster, and Fable as the things Eduardo most wants to draw. Though Tribal Flames is something because it does significantly increase Eduardo's clock.
Yep. Just being able to send 5 straight at Carmen's dome is gonna close the window that she has to find answer this grief pretty significantly.
And we get to see a little bit of the advantages of playing a 2 or 3 color deck in Modern today rather than going for full 5 colors, where Carmen's getting to run a bunch of Surveil lands here. So she's getting some filtering on a draw. We saw her bin that Lava Dot and get some extra value. Whereas Eduardo is in a pretty tough spot where he really needs to like finish up his domain and get to 5 basic land types since there's no Leyline in play. And that really curtails the cards he can actually fetch.
Yep. Here we see the slick shot show off come down and Eduardo let me double check Eduardo's deck list real quick to see if he did manage to fit. He managed to fit a Surveil land in, but it's a Raucous Theater, which he's already fetched Blood Crypt, so Raucous Theater certainly doesn't feel good to fetch and not even an option to fetch with this Windswept Heath. So currently,
Yeah.
as it stands, at the mercy of the top of his deck.
Yeah, and Eduardo was fully able to fetch the theater by playing the foothills if he wanted to, but the problem with decks like these and Seville lands is it's such a big cost to your mana base to fetch the wrong land on the wrong turn. So he's kind of priced into trying to build domain with that Tribal Flames in hand.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. Also, adding getting closer to domain makes obviously the Scion of Draco a better draw, but pick your poison cutting that off. Here, another land from Eduardo, not really what the doctor ordered, but gonna crunch in with this grief, put Carmen down to 11, a virtual 6 with this Tribal Flames. The window is closing, but Carmen still has a couple of turns, couple of good draw steps. Really only one good draw step is probably still enough to get this game closed. And looks like Eduardo may be electing to remove the slick shot show off here with the Tribal Flames instead of sandbagging it as a burn spell. What do you think of
Yeah,
that play?
that makes a lot of sense to me given the Lava Dot in the graveyard and the Pick Your Poison in hand. Eduardo can just go Swift Spear, Pick Your Poison, Lava Dot, and that's so much damage on its own with the show off. If Eduardo doesn't Tribal Flames the Slick Shot show off, that he kind of has to respect Carmen drawing something good off the top of her deck and having another spell to close out the game very quickly. I haven't done the math, but I believe that this turn would have been lethal if the Tribal Flames had not been spent. Well, with that Lava Dot, it definitely would have been lethal.
Yeah, and here we're seeing the strength of this prowess strategy, right? Carmen did not start the turn with a whole lot, but is representing a lot of damage with these lava darts and prowess triggers. This dart going after the grief gonna allow, looks like Carmen is just gonna send all of these copies of lava dart at grief and sort of dare Eduardo to draw another threat.
Yeah, and it's worth noting Eduardo's deck has less actual interaction than traditional scam decks. or like, and the interaction is sometimes clunkier. I don't believe there's like a lot of fatal pushes or anything. So there's no shield rid to top end as well. So the live draws for Eduardo's deck in this spot actually fewer than normal because there's just a lot of 2-card combos in his deck that aren't that good here.
Another land for Eduardo Sajgalik. Not what we're out of surveil lands, so don't have that as a draw. And here we go. Carmen draws Dragon's Rage Channeler, another threat to complement this Monastery Swift Spear. Now we're back to the onus being on Eduardo to find some way to stem the bleeding here.
Yeah, and this game is looking pretty dire for Eduardo. There's not a lot of threats he could draw that are going to cut it through this Pick Your Poison. Like, again, Leyline's the thing he wants here. Leyline's not a thing he can get. So he's just going to be forced to try and top deck maybe back-to-back answers to have a chance. Otherwise, these two threats are threatening lethal very quickly.
Well, here's one threat, and that while there's a Pick Your Poison to answer it and get the threat back, at the very least it buys Eduardo a turn of getting hit with Dragon's Rage Channeler, which isn't worth nothing.
Yeah, that definitely helps here. Pick Your Poison being a sorcery means Carmen cannot respond to the trigger on Leyline if they're on Leyline binding to keep the Dragon's Rage Channeler from getting hit.
Here we see Eduardo fire it off in the beginning of combat step, not going to give Carmen a window to get her channeler to get an attack in with the channeler, excuse me.
Yeah, and now that the Pick Your Poison is out of the way, at least this clears a room for Scion and Freako as a live draw. So Eduardo at least has a chance. I'd say far and away his best draws here are Scion into some black creature to try and get a lifelink going.
Another land for Eduardo. This has just been a pretty brutal sequence. And there's a lightning bolt. I think that's going to do it. I think we're going to see an all play design finals here for season 1 of MTGO Masters.
Just like we drew it up.
Carmen most likely checking Eduardo's deck list right now to see, is there something that can stop this lightning bolt from closing the game out? And Carmen electing to wait on it until upkeep. And here we're going to see a lightning bolt, and that is going to do it. We're going to see Carmen Klomparens, our second finalist. Congratulations to her. Tough game from Eduardo, but that's how these things go sometimes. Congratulations to you. Congratulations to Carmen, and I think we're gonna have a good time seeing y'all do battle in the finals.